In 2019, a team of investigators published a report on a single corporation, and they gave it a title with no room for interpretation. They called it the worst company in the world. Not one of the worst, the worst. They accused it of clearing the planet's rainforests, of a supply chain tangled up in child labor, of pushing contaminated food into people's kitchens, and of doing all of it while hiding in plain sight. And here is the strange part. You have almost certainly never heard of this company. It has no store you can walk into, no logo on your shelf, no stock you can buy. And yet there is a very good chance it was in the last meal you ate, and the one before that, because this invisible corporation quietly controls a staggering share of the food on the entire planet. Around a quarter of America's meat, much of the world's chocolate, and the grain that keeps whole nations alive. Its own hometown newspaper once compared it to the CIA. So how does a company accused of being the worst on Earth end up touching nearly every meal you eat while staying completely invisible? And what exactly is it hiding behind that curtain? Chapter 1. The Company in Everything. The company is called Cargill, and to understand why you have never heard of it, you first have to understand how absurdly large it is. Cargill is the biggest privately held company in the United States. For 36 of the 39 years that Forbes has been ranking private companies, Cargill has sat at number 1, and at its recent peak, it pulled in $177 billion in a single year, bigger than the economies of most countries on Earth. It employs roughly 155,000 people across 70 countries. And here is the part that should stop you cold. By many estimates, Cargill handles around a quarter of all the grain the United States exports and supplies around a quarter of America's meat. One company, a quarter of the meat. Now think about what that actually means for your day. Cargill is one of the largest beef processors on the continent. The patty in a fast food burger may well be theirs. They are one of the biggest turkey producers in the country. They make the salt in the shaker and the sweetener stirred into your soft drink. They are one of only a handful of companies that control the majority of the world's cocoa, which means the chocolate you love very likely started with them. If you ate today, Cargill was probably in the room. And yet there is no Cargill aisle at the supermarket, no Cargill logo winking at you from a package, no Cargill ad during the game. They sell almost nothing directly to you. They sell to the companies that sell to you, which means they get all of the reach of feeding the world and almost none of the attention. That is not an accident. That is the entire design. And to see where that design came from, you have to go back to a single wooden warehouse standing at the end of a railroad line just after the American Civil War. Chapter 2. The Warehouse at the End of the Line. In 1865, in the tiny town of Conover, Iowa, a man named William Wallace Cargill bought a grain storage warehouse. That was it. That was the entire empire. One building at the very end of a newly built railroad line in the middle of nowhere. But William Cargill understood something that most people around him did not. He was not really in the business of growing food, and he was not in the business of selling food to hungry families. He was in the business of the space in between, storing the grain and moving it. The farmers grew it, the families ate it, but everything in that vast, invisible middle, the storage and the shipping and the trading, was a choke point, and whoever controlled the choke point controlled the flow. Standing at the end of that railroad, William Cargill had positioned himself exactly where the grain had to pass. He did not need to be seen. He needed to be unavoidable. He spent nearly 40 years expanding that idea along the rail lines of the American frontier, and then, in 1909, he died of pneumonia, and the company nearly died with him. It turned out Cargill was buried in debt no one had fully understood, and within months, his widow died too, leaving the whole thing hanging by a thread. What saved it was a quiet, disciplined man who had married into the family, John McMillan Sr., William's son-in-law. McMillan pulled the company back from the edge, restructured its finances, and steered it into stability. And in doing so, he set a pattern that would hold for the next 150 years. because from that moment on, this would be a family company, the Cargills and the Macmillans bound together, passing control from generation to generation and guarding one thing above all else. Not a recipe, not a product, a habit of staying out of sight. Chapter 3. The family that draws the curtain. Here is a fact that sounds impossible. This family, the Cargill-Macmillan family, has produced 14 billionaires. 14. That is more billionaires in a single family than any other family anywhere on the planet, in all of recorded history. They are, by Forbes's count, the fourth richest family in America, sitting on tens of billions of dollars, and their fortune has quietly grown for over a century. And yet you could stop 1,000 people on the street, and not one of them could name a single member of this family. They do not host talk shows. They do not chase magazine covers. Roughly 100 family members still own around 90% of one of the largest companies on Earth, and they have made an art form out of being forgotten. That invisibility is a deliberate strategy, and it starts with one decision they have defended for over 150 years. They refuse to go public. Most giant companies eventually sell shares on the stock market. It is how you raise enormous amounts of money. But going public comes with a price the Cargills were never willing to pay: public scrutiny. A public company has to open its books, file detailed reports, answer to shareholders and analysts and journalists picking through every number. A private company answers to no one but itself, so the family made a choice that tells you everything about them. They keep around 80% of the company's profits locked inside the business every year to fund their own growth rather than take it out. Precisely so, they never have to go begging to Wall Street and never have to let the outside world look in. Their own local newspaper, the Star Tribune, once described Cargill as the agricultural industry's version of the CIA. Bloomberg called them one of America's richest but least known corporate dynasties. And a former Cargill chief executive put it most plainly of all when he explained the family's philosophy in a single sentence: they want to draw the curtain down. The question is, what exactly they were drawing it down over? Because a company this quiet, this private, this deliberately hidden, had built up a kind of power that most governments can only dream of. Chapter 4. The Men Who Move the Grain. To understand Cargill's real power, forget the burgers and the chocolate for a moment and think about grain. Wheat, corn, soybeans, the raw calories that keep entire nations alive. The global trade in that grain is not controlled by hundreds of competing companies. It is dominated by a tiny club, 4 giant trading houses so central to the world's food that they are known simply by their initials, A, B, C, D. The C is Cargill. Between them, this handful of firms is estimated to move the majority of the grain that crosses borders on Earth, by some estimates as much as 70 to 90%. When a country cannot feed itself, when a harvest fails, when a war cuts off supply, these are the companies that decide where the food goes and what it costs. And there is a hidden weapon inside that position that almost no one thinks about: information. A company like Cargill, with facilities and buyers and ships spread across 70 countries, often knows what is happening to the world's harvests before governments do. It can see a drought forming in one hemisphere and a bumper crop in another and quietly move accordingly. In the 1970s, when the Soviet Union secretly bought up enormous quantities of American grain, a deal so large it sent food prices soaring and became known as the Great Grain Robbery, it was the private trading houses, Cargill among them, sitting in the middle of it, moving the grain the world barely noticed leaving. This is the thing to understand about Cargill's invisibility. It is not just about avoiding embarrassment. When you control the choke points of the world's food, and you can see the board more clearly than the players, staying out of the headlines is not modesty. It is leverage. But leverage, when it goes wrong, has victims. And by 2011, the world was about to get a rare, ugly look at what happens behind Cargill's curtain. Quick one before we pull that curtain back. Everything so far has been the story of how this company built its power. What comes next is what it did with it, the part that got it branded the worst company in the world. If the hidden machinery behind everyday life is exactly the kind of thing you come here for, subscribe and stick with me. Because from here on, it gets dark. Chapter 5. What's Behind the Curtain? On August 3, 2011, Cargill was forced to do something a company that lives in the shadows dreads above all else. It had to put its own name in a national headline. That day, it recalled roughly 36 million pounds of ground turkey, the largest recall of its kind in United States history at the time. The meat, produced at a single plant in Springdale, Arkansas, was contaminated with a strain of salmonella that resisted multiple antibiotics. Before it was over, more than 130 people across dozens of states had been sickened, and one man in California was dead. For a company that had spent a century perfecting invisibility, 36 million pounds of poisoned turkey was the worst possible way to finally be seen. And the turkey was only the surface. For years, environmental investigators had been tracing Cargill's footprint across the planet, and what they found became a rap sheet. In the vast savannas and forests of Brazil, Cargill was named as one of the largest forces driving deforestation for soy, financing the clearing of wild land, building the silos and the roads, then shipping the grain out to feed livestock around the world. In West Africa, Cargill sat among the small group of traders controlling the world's cocoa, and investigators tied that cocoa supply to child labor on plantations, some of it the labor of children who should have been in school. In 2021, a case brought by men who said they had been trafficked and forced to work as children on Ivory Coast cocoa farms reached the United States Supreme Court. And the court ruled that they could not sue Cargill and its co-defendant in American courts at all. Then, in July of 2019, an environmental group called Mighty Earth published a 7,000-word report and gave it a title that pulled no punches. They called Cargill the worst company in the world, and buried in the response to that report was the single most revealing sentence in this entire story. One of the campaigners explained why Cargill had been able to get away with so much for so long, and the reason was chillingly simple. Cargill has only gotten away with it, he said, because it is not a company consumers can see. You cannot boycott a logo you have never noticed. You cannot punish a brand you cannot name. Their invisibility was not just protecting their privacy, it was protecting them from consequences. If a company this powerful, managing to stay this hidden is exactly the kind of story you wish more people knew about, then do the thing that actually helps. Subscribe. This channel exists to drag these invisible giants into the light, one story at a time, and there are a lot more of them than you would ever guess. Now back to the family behind the curtain, because the most uncomfortable part of this story is not the past. It is what happens to Cargill every single time the world goes hungry. Chapter 6. The Price of Hunger. Here is the part that is genuinely hard to sit with. Cargill's motto, the phrase it uses to describe its own purpose, is nourishing the world. But look closely at how the company actually makes its money, and you find an uncomfortable truth hiding inside that slogan. Because Cargill does not profit most when food is cheap and everyone is fed. It profits most when food is scarce and prices are spiking. When a pandemic snarls supply chains, when a war chokes off exports, when the cost of feeding a family jumps and the poorest people on earth start going hungry, that is when the companies that control the flow of food make their fortunes. And that is not a theory. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 and global food prices exploded, Cargill posted record profits, and 3 members of the quiet family that owns it saw their personal fortunes swell so much that they joined the ranks of the 500 richest people on the planet, worth billions of dollars each. Read that again slowly. The more expensive food became, the more the poorest went without, the richer this one family got. That is the engine humming underneath everything. A company built to control the choke points of the world's food, owned by a family that has spent 150 years making sure you never look directly at it, that quietly grows wealthier every time the world's dinner table gets more expensive. And once you see that pattern, you finally understand the answer to the question we started with. The real reason a company this enormous chose, on purpose, to remain a ghost. Final chapter, the invisible empire. Because here is what William Cargill understood standing at the end of that railroad in 1865, and what his family has protected ever since. The most powerful position in any business is not the famous brand on the shelf. It is the invisible layer underneath it, the one that owns the choke point that every visible brand depends on. The logo takes the applause and the logo takes the blame. But the company beneath it, the one that actually controls the flow, takes the profit and takes none of the risk. And there is only one way to hold that position safely, decade after decade, scandal after scandal. You have to stay invisible, because the moment the world can see you, the world can pressure you, boycott you, regulate you, stop you. Cargill's secrecy was never shyness, and it was never modesty. It was armor. The reason you have never heard of the company that feeds you is not that it failed to become famous. It is that staying unknown was always the plan. Because a company nobody can see is a company nobody can stop. If you made it all the way here, you already have the instinct this channel is built for. The one that hears you've never heard of them and immediately wants to know why. So if you want the next invisible empire, the next quiet giant, the next story hiding in plain sight, subscribe and stick around, because the biggest powers in the world are almost never the ones waving for your attention.